It's a piece of Saturday. Let's join Professor Buzzkill as he dumps on people from history who deserve more shame and opprobrium.
All right, Buzzkillers. Yes, it's one of our favorite types of shows. In fact, maybe it is our favorite type of show where we can really let out the venom. It's a piece of shit Saturday. And we're going to be talking about one of Hitler's underlings, one of the most nasty Nazis ever. And of course, who better to talk about World War II, to talk about Hitler and the Nazis, to talk about the 20th century than your favorite professor, Professor Philip Nash from Penn State. How are you, Professor? Thanks for coming on the show.
You are welcome, and thank you very much for that. By the way, absolutely right. When you think nasty Nazi, you definitely think Dr. Phil Nash.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I pick up the phone right away. We talked in one episode about the Cuban Missile Crisis a few months ago, and it reminds me we should have, I don't know, some sort of myth phone directly to your house.
The hotline.
The myth hotline, the Buzzkill hotline. Who is this guy? Who are we going to dump on?
What
kind of piece of shit are we going to dump on?
His name is Roland Freisler.
Freisler. Okay.
Freisler, Freisler. He was Hitler's hanging judge.
Wow.
I think that's probably the best. That's the bumper sticker definition. He is, to my mind, clearly one of the worst Nazis who's not terribly well known, right?
That's amazing.
We know about Joseph Goebbels and Heinrich Himmler and Hermann
horrific.
Goering. They're horrific. I'm not at all trying to exonerating any of these people, not even close. But there are some other Nazis. Let me put it this way. When it comes to evil, the Nazis had a deep bench.
Yeah.
And there are people like Roland Freisler who's actually pretty important, but I don't think he's quite as well known as he ought to be.
Yeah.
And as someone wrote about Hitler's foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, someone once said about him, I think it also counts for Freisler, and I'm quoting here what this one historian wrote, even the other Nazis hated him.
Yeah.
That's how bad, and that's true of Roland Freisler. He was not well liked or respected even by the other Nazis. When he dies mercifully at the end of this show, apparently a lot of the other Nazis are like, that's not such a bad thing. And you got to be pretty bad. Anyway.
Well, give us his background then.
So Roland Freisler, born in 1893. What's that? 4 years after Hitler. So he's a little bit younger. He was born in Lower Saxony, which is in the northwestern part of Germany. He was a fantastic student. And by the way, if you want to say anything nice about Roland Freisler, he was extremely bright, very sharp. And that's important, too, because a lot of the top Nazis, including some very evil people, were not the sharpest knives. That happens a fair amount in the Third Reich.
Right.
You can't say this about him. He's very, very smart, a great student. He served honorably in World War I. He was wounded and then captured by the Russians. He fought on the Eastern Front in World War I. Spent most of the war in a Russian prisoner of war camp. He learned Russian. He was put in charge by the Russians of sort of the management of camp food supplies. They may have actually given him the title commissar.
Oh.
And that's important because later on there were rumors that he had once been a Bolshevik. Apparently there's no actual evidence for that.
This is commissar, like commissary.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But remember, the Reds, right, the Bolsheviks, they also had commissars. They had political officers, right? That was definitely that was a loaded term back in the day.
Yeah, but the cafeteria at some places is also called the commissariat.
Exactly, it's called the commissariat. Correct.
Commissariat.
In any case, later on,
commissarium, right?
No, commissariat, I think.
Okay.
No, sorry, commissary.
Commissary, right?
Ends with a Y.
Well, there you go, Buzzkillers. This is what keeps us up at
exactly. And now you can listen as we workshop our vocabulary.
Warner Brothers Studio, for instance, had a commissary because that's where all the stars went to eat.
There you go. Yes, that isn't. Yeah, they don't use that term anymore.
No,
anyway,
probably
but later on, among other Nazis, including Adolf Hitler used to refer to him as that old Bolshevik.
Wow,
and it may actually have helped prevent him from rising to the very, very top. This sort of baggage, although just parenthetically. This was not uncommon. A lot of top Nazis had sort of skeletons in their closet from the Nazis' own standpoint, and that was not necessarily a bad thing from Hitler's standpoint because then you had a lever over that person.
Gotcha.
Like, for example, Reinhard Heydrich, who the allegation was that he had Jewish blood, even though he didn't.
Yeah.
That was sort of could be held against him, and then you can keep him in check, right? So, anyway, he returned from the prisoner of war camp at the end of the war. He got his law degree in the 1920s. He entered private practice. I think he even had a post on a city council at one point in his hometown. He then very quickly entered extreme right-wing politics. He joined the Nazi Party in 1923. That makes him an alte Kämpfer. That makes him one of the original sort of hardcore, right? The Nazis made this distinction. We talked about this in another show, basically. Did you join before it was cool? If I can put it that way. Because once the Nazis make it big, and certainly once they come to power, then of course a lot of people join the Nazi Party. And then you're just like, you're an opportunist, conceivably. If you joined back in 1923, you were clearly a devoted Nazi.
Right.
So in the 20s and into the early 30s, he earned a very strong reputation in the Nazi Party, as someone who defended Nazis in court.
Okay.
And, a lot of Nazi stormtroopers, right? They're thugs, right? They're street thugs. A lot of those people end up on the wrong side of the law and end up in court, and he defends a lot of them.
Obviously during the Weimar Republic.
During the Weimar Republic, correct. And apparently does a very, very good job. He's a superior legal mind. There's no question about that, and a very effective defense attorney. And this gets him a reputation among the Nazis as sort of one of their better legal lights, basically.
Okay. Well, that's 23, presumably through the rest of the 20s. What happens after Hitler comes to power?
Sure. So Hitler comes to power in 1933. Freisler is given the job of state secretary at the Prussian Ministry of Justice. So Prussia is the big province in northern Germany, right? It has just like our federal system.
Yeah.
They've got provincial Ministry of Justice. He was the state secretary there for most of his career. So 34 to 42, well into World War II, he is the state secretary at the Reich Ministry of Justice. So he goes from the provincial level to the national level.
Oh, all right.
State secretary of the Reich Ministry of Justice. That would be, in our system, the U.S. system, that would be the equivalent of being an undersecretary or an assistant secretary at our Department of Justice.
Gotcha.
So he's not the top cabinet official, but he's just the second or third rank. So it's a pretty powerful, influential position. Fun fact, he did take part in the infamous Wannsee Conference, January 1942.
Okay. Now, why is this a fun fact? Sorry.
You're right. I'm being a smartass. There's nothing fun about it. He was present at the Wannsee Conference. This was the infamous conference where they it's the end of the decision-making process for deciding upon the Holocaust. So this was an interagency meeting.
Right.
Where Adolf Eichmann was there, Reinhard Heydrich was there, all the party, various bureaucracies were represented. He represented the justice system. And they were basically there to coordinate and all get on the same page for the Holocaust, which was then going to unfold, especially thereafter in 1942. We do not know, by the way, what he said at that meeting. We have the very famous minutes from that meeting taken by Adolf Eichmann. We don't know what he actually said. He apparently didn't stand out in the meeting.
The Wannsee Conference sounds like a show in itself.
Yeah. Entire books have been written by the Wannsee Conference.
Right.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Wannsee Conference,
Yeah, Wannsee is a lake outside Berlin.
Okay.
He was never admitted to Hitler's inner circle. He was passed over for Minister of Justice, including when there was a vacancy, I believe, in 1941. Mm-hmm. And I think don't quote me, but that may have been the case where Hitler said, someone had recommended Freisler for the job. And Hitler apparently said, my God, no, not that old Bolshevik.
Yeah.
In other words, Hitler thought he was good, but not that good. Mm-hmm. So, and by the way, so he's passed over for the top position despite his craven efforts to impress. Something you see throughout his career in the 30s and early 40s is he's always trying to, get in good with the top Nazis, right? To be like the most loyal, the most effective guy, right? He's clearly very ambitious. Very sort of subservient to higher authority. In mid-1942, he is appointed chief judge of the Volksgerichtshof. And that's the Volksgerichtshof, which is such a mouthful. I'm just going to use the letters VGH for the rest of the show.
Yeah, which we should do with a lot of these big, long German words.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's one of those compound words.
What is it? What was the VGH?
What was it? First of all, the word, technically what it means is people's court.
Oh,
which, really unfortunate translation there. So we won't use that term, but we'll just use VGH. So the Nazis had imposed their usual Nazification on the existing legal system that they inherited from the Weimar Republic and then went way, way back to the pre-Weimar years. Mm-hmm. This system, even though it was Nazified, for example, if you were an anti-Nazi judge, most of them were very conservative, but if you were an anti-Nazi judge, they'd replace you. So to some extent, the existing legal system was Nazified, quote unquote. It nevertheless upheld some of the pre-Nazi rules and standards, and apparently Hitler and other top Nazis were thus not completely satisfied with it. So in 1934, right after just about 1 year in power, the Nazis established the VGH, which I've seen described as a sort of a parallel legal universe. So it's separate from the existing legal system.
That's interesting.
It has its own independent existence. And what it represented basically was not the Nazis' sort of ideal version of the law unleashed and reflected, among other things, Adolf Hitler's personal contempt for the existing legal system. So, for example, the VGH routinely violated the ancient, this comes from common law and from Roman law, the ancient principle of no punishment without law. In other words,
you have to have broken a law.
You have to have broken a law, and everyone has to know that was a law when they broke it for them to be punished for it, right? Or you've heard the term ex post facto laws, right? Those are illegal in the United States for good reason, right? You can't pass a law and say, oh, yeah, you did this back when it was legal, but we're going to punish you for it anyway. Or alternatively, you can't have laws that are so vague that basically, we'll drag you in and convict you in it, even though it's not clear that you actually violated any law.
Right.
We'll just sort of, call them as we see them. You can't do that in basically the legal system that the Western world had long relied on. But the VGH doesn't operate that way. They are quite happy to punish people for things that were not clearly illegal or to use very, very vague laws to punish people in a very arbitrary way. So, and that's the way to think about it. The VGH actually represents arbitrary ruthlessness, totally contrary to, among other things, the law-abiding image of the Third Reich, right? The image, when we talked about this in another show, the image of the Third Reich was it's all about law and order. It's all about sticking to the letter of the law and being very correct and all these things. So, for example, the Nazis, they still continue to produce under the existing legal system their legal statistical abstract, right? The big fat volume that comes out every year that gives you all the data about your legal system, right? Number of violations of this law, number of convictions, et cetera, sort of like an almanac, basically, legal system. The VGH and its work did not appear in this volume. So it's not only a parallel thing, it's sort of off the books.
Yikes.
And frees people like Roland Freisler, as we'll see, do what they will. So it's jurisdiction. So it's formal jurisdiction. The VGH had five areas. One was called Landesverrat, which is basically state treason. So not provincial, but treason against the state involving a foreign country.
Yep.
Like, for example, if you sold secrets to a foreign power.
Yeah.
You could be found guilty of Landesverrat. Secondly was what's called Hochverrat or high treason, which is sort of basically the other kind. My personal favorite is number 3, preparing for treason.
What? Before you've committed a crime?
It sounds a little like pre-crime from Minority Report, doesn't it? But apparently you could be charged and convicted and even executed for preparing for treason.
So they could even theoretically get you for thinking about treason.
Theoretically.
Yeah.
Then there's one that we talked about. We did a combined Man Crush Monday and Women Crush Wednesday on the Hempels, correct. And they were found guilty, as many of the victims of the VGH were found guilty of, was what's number 4. It's called Wehrkraftzersetzung. Which is a great sort of very loose, vague Nazi term, Wehrkraftzersetzung, which means undermining the national defense.
Gotcha.
Or undermining the armed forces, right? And then your immediate question should be, well, what on earth does that mean?
Yeah, could mean anything.
And the question is, and the answer is, they know it when they see it.
Yeah.
So it was the most common charge.
And
by the way, it could include anything, including, and this actually happened, including cracking an anti-Nazi joke.
Wow.
Including, by the way, in private.
Wow.
So this is not just about the public sphere. Cracking a joke, giving a prisoner of war a piece of bread when they were hungry, that could be interpreted as Wehrkraftzersetzung.
Holy cow.
And could, by the way, they didn't execute everybody, but they often handed down harsh punishments. I may have mentioned in another show, I've actually seen a legal document, sort of a court proceeding, where someone was overheard cracking an anti-Hitler joke on a streetcar. Someone ratted them out. They were arrested. They were found guilty, and their sentence was 5 years hard labor.
My God.
I mean, I guess the good news is that they weren't executed, but 5 years hard labor for cracking a joke. And that was brought to you by your VGH. And then finally, and this is another very elastic category, favoring the enemy.
Yeah, that's
like, what constitutes favoring the enemy?
Yeah.
Don't know this for a fact. I suspect listening to a foreign radio broadcast.
Or preferring French baguettes over German bread.
I mean, who knows? And that's the thing. You never know. And that's one of the aspects of terror that helped the Nazi machine work.
Okay, so then what did Freisler do with the VGH?
Right, because he didn't invent the VGH.
Yeah, right, okay.
But he was put in charge. I would say that under the VGH, Roland Freisler comes into his own as a capital P and capital S piece of shit.
Yeah.
So now, I don't know, this is going to sound odd. In fairness, in context, this is not just about him.
Oh, okay.
So, and it's not just the VGH, but his timing, considering what a POS he was, his timing's good because in 1942, the whole Nazi system is going much harder at opponents. Internally and externally, there's much more of a so-called total war mindset because the Nazis are losing the war starting in 1942. They become more desperate. They become much more keen on identifying threats and eliminating them.
Yeah.
So keep that in mind when we talk about how the VGH changes under Freisler. And that's part of the answer is it didn't only change under Freisler. In 1942, it was starting to change already, and then he picks up the ball and runs with it. But there is this more desperate context. But he is super vicious.
Yeah.
And part of the problem is, from our standpoint, is that when he's not just a judge, quote unquote, right? He's not just the chief judge of the VCH. He also acts as a prosecutor. That's how loosey-goosey this is. From the bench, he prosecutes as well, right? He's not sort of sitting back and judging what the defense and the prosecution is saying. By the way, there are defense attorneys in the court in the VGH. They basically don't say anything or do anything.
Wow.
Because they know better.
Wow.
They're there just for appearance sake. But a lot of the prosecutor's job was done by the judge. So, for example, you look at, when I say super vicious, look at some of the numbers. So, the percentage of VGH sentences that were death sentences were 8% in 1941.
Right.
They were 46% in 1942.
Wow.
Now, he's only appointed in August. So, like I said, this is partly what I mentioned a minute ago. Already the VGH is becoming much more vicious and hardcore. But then it gets worse. In 43 to 45, the last 3 years of the war, when it's just him in charge, the percentage of sentences that are death sentences are between 48 and 50%, so a little bit higher even than the 1942 figure, for which he was partly responsible.
And those are for any of those 5 categories of crimes, some of which were very sort of
correct,
wide open.
Right. So, in other words, those are not, and it's not like, just for the record, it's not like they're finding more legitimate cases of high treason.
No. Yeah.
No, they're just giving more people, including people with very sort of minor offenses, they're giving them the death penalty.
God.
So, what is the number of death sentences? Look at, so between 1934 and 1941, typically the VGH handed out 33 death sentences per year. Okay. Which is plenty, by the way. I mean, that's not a low number, right? That's almost 3 a month per year for 7 years. Yeah. Between 1942 and 45, so for the most part, the responsibility to Freisler, they execute 1,650 people per year.
1,600. My God. Yeah. This is way, way above French Revolutionary guillotine.
Oh, yeah. And there were severe penalties for trivial offenses too, right? Keep in mind, I mean, we obviously focused on the death penalty for good reason, but a lot of people were going away to prison for a long, long time for minor offenses. The total number of executions, mostly by guillotine, by the way.
Yeah, which is, it's really putting you in this position where you're just deliberately old-fashioned, deliberately brutal.
Right, although I did read in at least one case, apparently they thought about hanging some defendants, but apparently they went to the guillotine. And the reasoning I read was if they hang someone, they were worried that person would become a martyr, which I don't quite understand, but maybe because of the hanging procedure was public or more people were allowed to attend or whatever. Yeah. But in other case, that was the reason they stayed away in that case anyway. But they became very, very comfortable using the guillotine. The total number of dead, we don't have perfect records. Some of those records were destroyed. But the low estimate is 5,200 people, and the high estimate is about 6,000.
I keep saying, my God, my God, my God. But these are just...
And by the way, these are...
shocking numbers.
As far as I know, the vast majority, if not all of the victims, are German citizens.
Yeah.
Right? This is not, so in other words, this is completely separate from the Holocaust and the other sort of war crimes and the other stuff the Germans are doing throughout occupied Europe.
Aren't captured prisoners of war.
No, these people like the Hampels. These are, who leave postcards or other German opponents of the regime, real or imagined.
Okay, that makes me think, there are plots to kill Hitler. There are plots to overthrow him. That when those people got caught, what did he do to them?
Right. And that was one of his highest profile cases. If you go on YouTube, you can see all sorts of documentaries about if you just enter Roland Freisler in the search box on YouTube, you'll find all sorts of documentaries, some of them quite good. You'll also, by the way, you can find original newsreel footage that was used at the time. But those so the 20th of July, 1944, this is the people, including Tom Cruise, who tried to kill Adolf Hitler. If you've seen the movie Valkyrie, you know what I'm talking about. So they failed to kill him. As you might imagine, we talked about this in another show, the regime went super hard at these people. They forced even at best a peripheral figure like Erwin Rommel to kill himself. Otherwise, they were going to kill him and his family. They went really hard at these people. Some of the most prominent plotters were dragged in front of the VGH. By the way, Roland Freisler, part of his whole self-promotion mode was he would often, if someone was arrested, he'd read about the case and then say, "Oh, I'm trying that one." In other words, he would deliberately. By the way, people may have heard of the White Rose. These are the the Germans made some terrific movies about them. Sophie Scholl and her brother and some other university students and a couple of professors who are opponents of the regime. They were captured in early 1943. Freisler immediately flew down to Munich to preside over the trial.
Wow,
which ended in their executions, of course. But he often made sure, right? In other words, and once again, this tells you what you need to know about this quote unquote legal system. There's not like some rotation of judges and you don't know which judge you're going to get, right? In this case, the judge picks and chooses high-profile cases that he likes and doesn't preside over the others. By the way, there were other VGH judges. There were other VGH proceedings. It's just his was the most prominent one. So it was a show trial. He and the VGH, they deliberately humiliated the defendants. There was one defendant, a former field marshal, I believe, certainly a top general. They denied him his dentures in court.
Oh, Lord.
There were others, they gave them shabby clothing that was far too large, and they didn't give him a belt. So there was one field marshal, von Witzleben, I believe. He was dragged before the court. Throughout the proceeding, he had to hold up his pants with one hand because otherwise his pants would have fallen down. And Freisler scolded him and said, basically, "You dirty old man, why do you keep fiddling with your trousers?"
As we'll see in a minute, Freisler's in-court manner isn't exactly humane.
And it was one of those things that was actually embarrassing for other Nazis that he was so bad. But in the court, he especially with these defendants, he alternately asked logical probing questions with just these torrents of abuse screamed at the top of his lungs.
Yeah.
So, for example, one defendant, his name was Ulrich Wilhelm Graf von Schwerin und Schwanenfeld. One of those.
That's the greatest German name
It
I've
is
ever
a pretty
heard.
good one, right? He comes from nobility.
There are two Vons in there.
Yeah, and that happened a lot. And so he was from the nobility. He was an army staff officer, and he was actually, even though if you listen to the clip or watch the footage, he's very low key. He's very sort of retiring, but he stands his ground. He stands. He's by the way, he's called up. He's standing about 15 feet away from Freisler, and he has the temerity to mention the many German murders in Poland and occupied Poland that helped motivate him to. He's explaining himself. He's like, here's why I entered the resistance, because this is a murderous regime.
And here's a clip of that exchange. And Buzzkillers, you'd be shocked to hear a judge taking the tone of voice and the yelling that he does.
So just to translate, because we could not find you wanted to hear his voice, right? We wanted you to hear his voice and not to hear the dubbed English. He basically screams, "Murderers, you are a miserable scum."
And the murderers is referring to the defendant saying, "I was."
That's right. When I heard about the many murders, and then immediately Freisler interrupts him and screams, "Murderers, you are a miserable scum." He did this all the time at trial. He often screamed so loudly that it distorted the recording. And the sound people, by the way, had asked him, like, don't scream at the top of your lungs because it's going to screw up the recording. And he did it anyway.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of distorted in some cases.
All right. So we know he did all of this stuff as a judge, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What's his ultimate fate?
Believe it or not, even though this is a really, really disgusting person and a disgusting topic, actually, you can argue that there's a happy ending to this story.
Oh, right. Okay.
And the happy ending, the happy ending is delivered by the United States Army Air Force.
Oh, okay.
On February 3rd, 1945, when they launch a truly massive air raid on Berlin, 1,500 bombers. Berlin had been bombed earlier, not quite on this scale.
Yeah.
A lot of the bombs hit the government quarter. And so there was an air raid siren, as there always was, and all the people in the VGH headed for the bomb shelters underground. But our boy, Roland Freisler, he stopped to grab some files. So, by the way, there's some other slightly different versions of this story, but if that version is true, you can argue that the court files killed him. Which, that's some pretty sweet payback, I think. Anyway, a bomb directly hit the building. A column and a ceiling beam in the building collapsed on him and crushed him to death, like immediately.
Wow.
So
he might have even been grabbing files that could have later been used by the Nuremberg Tribunal, which would also kill him. But the Air Force took care of all of that.
Actually, I want to say that the files he had, they were the files of another 20th of July conspirator who ended up being acquitted or surviving, which I think is also ironic.
Okay.
So rest in peace, Roland Freisler. Apparently, I remember reading his body was...
Sorry, we have to say rest in peace of shit.
Yeah, sorry.
We can't let the word peace...
Good point.
We will
rest in peace of shit, Roland Freisler. Apparently, when his body was brought into either the morgue or the hospital, I forget, apparently someone said audibly at the time, like, basically, God is just... Basically, like he had it coming. Like I said, he was not very popular.
And if Nazis are saying that, then you really are.
Yeah, he was not openly mourned. Like, what a tragedy. Which, by the way, if you look at someone like Reinhard Heydrich, and they had a huge state funeral, and Hitler spoke there, and a lot of people were definitely unhappy. This case, maybe not so much.
Wow.
So he's dead. There is a sad side note here. No VGH judges or prosecutors were punished after the war.
Oh, Lordy.
You see this a lot throughout the Nazi bureaucracy, mid to relatively high level people. A lot of them just were not punished. This, by the way, was true a lot of the Nazi doctors who did the nasty experiments at Auschwitz. Some of those people were not punished. Some of them went on to medical careers, right? They practiced medicine. Same here. Some of these people went on to successful legal careers in West Germany after the war.
That's just sickening.
And here's the kicker. Freisler's widow, Ms. Freisler, was given a government pension after the war. And the argument was her husband could conceivably have gone on to a successful legal career, so she deserves a legal pension. That's how, and in some other shows, we're going to talk about the lack of justice at the end of the Third Reich. And this certainly in this case, and I've shuddered to think what would have happened to Freisler himself. I could imagine him not being punished very hard at all, despite being Hitler's hanging judge.
Well, as we always ask in these POS shows, even in the Man Crush Mondays and the Woman Crush Wednesdays, give us your bottom line, Professor.
So, as usual in the Third Reich, even though I do not hesitate for a second to declare Freisler a piece of shit, the blame, as usual, ultimately goes to Adolf Hitler.
Right.
Roland Freisler, I've seen no evidence that Roland Freisler, even though he didn't rise to the top, may have been denied the job he really wanted, which was Minister of Justice. There's no reason to believe he did anything that Adolf Hitler did not or would not have approved of. Right? He's not a rogue in that sense. Right?
Okay.
So ultimate responsibility goes with Adolf Hitler. If Adolf Hitler thought, for example, that guillotining 5,200 people was too many, he could have put a stop to it.
Right.
And he clearly didn't. No, it's the same with these other Nazi atrocities, including the Holocaust, including all the war crimes, right? Hitler bears ultimate responsibility. Having said that, there is also no reason to believe that someone who is at least somewhat slightly less vicious than Roland Freisler could have held and kept that job. Right? In other words, I can imagine someone who only executed 1,000 people, and Hitler would have been okay with that, right? In other words, Hitler's ultimately responsible, but Freisler's given a lot of leeway.
Yeah.
And what does Freisler do with that leeway? He's responsible for the deaths of thousands of people, many of whom did absolutely nothing wrong and were not a threat to the regime.
Right.
So the number of death sentences alone, I think, is way, way over the top, way out of any conceivable objective assessment of what internal threats this regime faced. Right.
Yeah.
And yet they're chopping off heads. What's that? Well over 100 a month. At one point. 3 a day. They're chopping off heads.
That's just shocking.
So, he was a committed, eager Nazi, and the system produced and rewarded and tolerated such figures, but still, he deserves our label, piece of shit.
Well, there you have it, Buzzkillers. You can't get any more clear example of someone who deserves a piece of shit Saturday designation. And we have joked about this throughout the show, but of course we're doing that. But we really don't want that to undermine the idea that these Nazi crimes are absolutely horrific and unforgivable.
Absolutely.
But one thing we do want to do is thank you, Professor, for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Always happy to be here.
And Buzzkillers, please remember to go to ProfessorBuzzkill.com for all the shows. Support us on Patreon if you can. And don't forget, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and on any of your podcast platforms that you might use. It helps an enormous amount in getting the word out, and we need to get the word out. We'll keep talking to you as we always do next time.